Thank you. I'm going to be sitting, so yeah. Let me see. I think I'm good. Hi, Kate. Yeah, we're all good. My people are here. Oh. This is what you wanted, right? For us to sit? You wanted me to sit? Okay.
That's what, yeah, I just wanted you on the ends. And we do have an extra chair, but there's no room. Do you want to take the chair?
Yeah. And Kate, will you be the timekeeper? Will you be the timekeeper?
I probably won't.
Because you're going to be in and out?
Yeah. If you give me, but I think I have just enough time where I can go and grab my iPad that does have timekeeping on it, and I can go and put that right in the front. So
Okay,
give me 1 second.
that'll be good. That'll be good. Okay. Okay, Gabriela? Yes. Mic'd. All right. How is that? Is that better? All right. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to our session. Make sure you're in the right room because we're about to begin a very, very interesting session. I'm Dr. Vita Pickrum. I am the president of Delaware State University's Foundation and VP for Advancement, and also the founder for the HBCU Philanthropy Symposium. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for this distinguished group of panelists. And what we decided is that each panelist, as I call their name, they will give a brief introduction of themselves. Their full bios are in the app, which all of you should have. So we'll begin. We have a lot to cover, and we have 45 minutes, so we're going to try to get through it. We will reserve some time at the end for Q&A, so have your questions ready, okay? All right, so let's begin. Dr. Laura Boche, Program Officer, ECMC Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Oh, I'm not on.
Let's see.
Challenge of going first. Laura Boche, ECMC Foundation. I'm new to philanthropy. I started with ECMC Foundation in March and have had a career in higher education, previously coming from the Minnesota State System Office as the coordinator of strategic initiatives, serving as an academic dean at a community college, and then a variety of other student affairs, student success related roles as well.
Gabriela Torres, Deputy Director of Transformation at Scale, Postsecondary Success, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Good afternoon, Gabriela Torres. I've been with the Gates Foundation for about 5 years. First 4 years as a senior program officer for our Intermediaries for Scale body of work, followed by the last couple years as a Deputy Director of Transformation at Scale more broadly. My background is also higher education, specifically the student affairs side. I consider myself a lifelong student affairs practitioner. I miss working directly with students each and every day. And that formal and informal education that I got during my time at the institution definitely informs my day-to-day practice and decision-making.
Thank you. And Dr. Jasmine Haywood, Strategy Director of the Lumina Foundation.
Thank you, Vita. Jasmine Haywood. I'm at Lumina. I've been at Lumina for about 7 years or so. We are actually headquartered here in Indianapolis, so welcome everyone to Indy. We also have an office in DC. I similarly came to Lumina with a kind of diverse background in terms of experience in the academy as a faculty member and student affairs as well. My first few years at Lumina, I led our learning and evaluation portfolio, and about 4 years ago, transitioned to my current role as Strategy Director for Student Success.
Thank you very much. So we're going to begin this session, and I'll just read the first part of it for you. Philanthropy has long played a critical role in driving forward the college completion movement, and in this session, our experts from leading foundations, as you heard, will share the priorities of their organizations and trends for grants and giving in the higher education space. So we'll begin. We have several questions. Some of the questions all three of the panelists will answer, and others will be directed to specific panelists, and others will have the opportunity to respond if, in the interest of time, we want to get through everything so we can also hear from you as well. So our first question, answered by all of our panelists, will be, what is your foundation's definition of student success, and how does it shape your funding priorities? And I'll start with you, Jasmine.
So we consider student success really an amalgamation of outcomes related to persistence, retention, completion, graduation. They can be quantitative, smaller metrics like credit accumulation, course completion, and then those larger metrics that I mentioned. What I also want to say to complement that is that we also envision student success to be non-quantitative things, right? And so things like, thinking about mental health and wellness, and things like, access to high-impact practices, or, alignment with employability, career outcomes. So thinking about it holistically in terms of quantitative and qualitative indicators.
Okay. Gabriela?
So broadly, at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we believe that all lives have equal value. And what that means at the post-secondary success level in terms of how we define success is we really prioritize investments and research and learning that eliminates the obstacles for students on their academic pathways. Particularly in the post-secondary success team, it looks like our work revolving around a definition of institutional transformation, because we believe it's not about changing the student, but it's about creating opportunities and eliminating institutional or systemic barriers to students achieving their aspirations. Within that, I would say we also hyper-focus on our, what we call focus student populations. So we unapologetically focus on equitable outcomes for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income students. And so you will see in our investment making and our strategy development that equitable outcomes are the priority and how we define success. I guess the last part I'd add to that is, when we say institutional transformation, we mean something very specific. So we have a definition of institutional transformation, which is about the fundamental realignment of an institution's policies, structures, and business models towards the end of more equitable outcomes for those focused student populations.
Thank you, Gabriela. Laura.
Thank you. At the ECMC Foundation, we just recently launched our North Star goal earlier this year, which is really our definition of student success. So our North Star goal is by the year 2040, we hope to eliminate all post-secondary educational equity gaps in terms of completion so that all learners can graduate and complete at the same rate. So that's really where our grant making is centered. We have 3 strategic priorities that we focus on. 1 is removing barriers to completion. 2 is building the capacity of institutions, organizations, and systems. And 3 is transforming the post-secondary ecosystem. And the way in which we operationalize those 3 priorities is through our grant-making efforts. And we kind of have 2 buckets of grant making. We have our initiatives grant making, which is about half of our grant making. And those are populations or themes that have emerged that we are dedicating funds to. So we have 6. They are the Men of Color Initiative, Student Basic Needs, our CTE Leadership Collaborative, Rural Impact Initiative, Single Mother Student Success, and Transfer Students. I knew I might forget one. And then half of our grant making is reserved for what we call strategically responsive grant making. So that's the team that I sit on, where we really have our ear to the ground to really meet the needs of the higher education landscape. So some themes that we're starting to see emerge in that portfolio include holistic advising, small grants, higher ed in prison, leadership development or faculty development, and then non-credit to credit mobility. And one thing that we really try to remain accessible to applicants is through our open LOI process. So we accept applications on a rolling basis.
Thank you for that. Our next question, all 3 panelists will address. How do you measure your foundation's long-term impact beyond traditional metrics like graduation rates? Laura, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I just mentioned our North Star goal. So as a brief reminder, by 2040, closing all post-secondary completion gaps. And so the way in which we're thinking about this is we're hoping to create a baseline report. We're creating an impact measurement framework. So a baseline report will come out in early next year, 2025, which will really be an analysis of the current state of post-secondary completion, disaggregating by priority demographics, including income, geography, race and ethnicity, and gender, and then creating a 3-tiered system of measurements. So the first tier is sort of a broader bucket of the state of economic and social mobility. So looking at total earnings, GDP, growth, poverty reduction for those underserved learners. The second tier would be the state of closing post-secondary completion gaps, specifically looking at bachelor's degree completion, associate's degree completion, and credentials of value as well. And then that third tier of measurement is really looking at our work, our impact, our grant making. Where do we need to make some changes? Where do we need to invest more to help us achieve our goal? So that's all in that baseline report. Additionally, we will be doing some biennial reporting as well, in addition to having a data dashboard on our website as well, so that we can hold ourselves accountable, we can partner with others, and just to be able to track our progress towards the 2040 goal. In addition, we also allow our applicants to create their own measures of success. And so sometimes this can look like student level changes, an increase in GPA, decrease in DFW rates, persistence, completion. Sometimes this can look like institutional changes, changes in policy, or even statewide or system changes, increase in resources. So we really kind of work with our applicants to develop measures of success that are both meaningful to them and meaningful to us.
All right, I'm gonna keep it real. So the question is about non-traditional or beyond traditional metrics. I would say the Gates Foundation still prioritizes some fundamental, what we would call traditional metrics. You're still gonna see up there first year course completion ratio, first year retention, overall graduation. What I would say is instead of replacing or abandoning those metrics, it's broadening the scope of what we're really prioritizing in a couple of unique ways. So one is when I talk about transformation at scale, that work used to be called proof of scale. And the reason it used to be called proof of scale is because the end goal of a lot of our investment portfolios, especially those that run significant lengths of time, is that they are serving as proof points for what works. And who are those proof points informing? Not just the institutions, the organizations, et cetera, but state and federal policymakers to say, hey, we see that this approach was taken, we see the successful outcomes, we're gonna fund the replication of this work. And so that's not always super clear in how we talk about our work, but that is very much one of the end goals. Another part that I would bring specific to the portfolio that we work with is around this concept of 200 plus institutions towards a shared outcome, right? So there is something there around momentum building. I think that you hear that a lot, even in the alliance work that CCA does. Institutions going alone will go somewhere and probably progress, but when you go together, I think the foundation believes in our strategy development that it could be that much more effective, that much more efficient, and maybe that less painful, right? Because some of this change is very hard at the personal, individual level, not just for students, but for faculty, staff, administrators at institutions.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try and think about how to expand on things, because Lumina certainly, a lot of what my colleagues have already mentioned definitely resonates with the way we approach our work. And so I mentioned earlier, I started off at Lumina leading our learning and evaluation portfolio. And so part of my job in that role was to think about how we are going to learn from our work and measure progress. And so, we've historically taken into consideration things like policy and practice change, adoption and implementation, in addition to the broader student success indicators that we all have already spoken to. More recently, the past few years, similar to what Gabriela said, we've taken a yes and approach. Yes, graduation, attainment, completion is important, and to what end? And if a student graduates with a college degree, but they are unable to find themselves in a successful and fulfilling career, and they're not experiencing the value of their degree in the labor market, then, what is our responsibility in that? And so the past few years, we've, taken a more expansive, more broad, multidimensional approach to think about things like employer outcomes, earnings, and how we might start to take into consideration those other metrics in measuring the impact beyond graduation. And so that's what we've been noodling on the past few years as we approach the end of our goal in 2025 and as we get ready to announce our new goal.
Thank you, Jasmine. And Jasmine, I'm going to stay with you. The next question is, how have your definitions and considerations around the value of higher education changed? And how has that informed your funding strategy?
So Lumina has always viewed value as an important component of post-secondary education, higher education. We've talked about the way we approach our work in terms of two pillars around equity and quality in the past. And I think, moving forward, where we are going to go, where we hope to go is really just doubling down on expanding the notions of what it means to be a successful higher education institution. So not only do we want our institutions to get students to the door, in the door, through the door, but we also need them to get good jobs and make a living wage. And so really doubling down when it comes to that and thinking about How do we, when historically, particularly in the four-year space, there's been some tensions in how to actually design that work and implement that work. And so how do we as funders realistically assess where the field is when it comes to that work, to doing things like employer-aligned credentials and, partnering with employers, and how do we meet them where they are to be able to catalyze more of that work that is impactful. And the last thing I'll say is thinking about this question, value for whom? And so what we don't want to do is create a two-tier system of education in which there is a certain group of students that are majority white that experience the value of a higher education degree in a particular way. But then there are students that are low income, students of color, et cetera, that don't experience the value of education. And sometimes they have the same credential from the same institution, maybe from the same program. And so how do we really look at value through a lens of equity? And then how do we work on the narrative of that? Because the data say that a four-year credential will lead to better socioeconomic mobility, especially for minoritized students. And yet, there is growing distrust in the value of a higher education degree. And so there's a disconnect there. And the distrust is, cuts across all races and ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds. And so how do we fill that gap and mend that disconnect in the words we're using to talk about value? And for certain students, they actually have not experienced the value of a higher education degree, and they are disillusioned, rightfully so. And some of that is because the system is broken, right? And so it is complicated and nuanced, and we're trying to take that all into consideration as we think about, we do plan to double down next year. We're announcing our new goal at late Q1 next year. And so right now we are in the thick of things, thinking about how we're going to roll that out and how we're going to double down on the true value of a credential for all students.
Thank you for that. Gabriela, if you could respond to the same question.
I won't go too in-depth because I think Jasmine hit on a lot of similarities. And I see that not as duplicative, but as aligned, which from a funder's perspective, I think is a good thing. And so the Gates Foundation's post-secondary success strategy iteration has really mirrored that of the field, or to some extent the ed reform movement, right? So we hyper-focused on access very early on, 15 so years ago, access and affordability. Then we realized students were getting enrolled, but were they graduating? So it's access to what? And so we switched over to completion overall. Then we learned, hey, that's great. Many of the institutions who were engaged with our investments at that time saw increases in completion, but equity gaps did not close. In some instances, their completion increased and their equity gaps also increased. And so we said, okay, we need to get smarter. We need to be more intentional, which is where we named our focus student populations and our prioritization of equitable outcomes, not just overall completion. I think where we're headed is a very similar direction to what was just spoken about, is equitable value for whom, and then also what is equitable value. We've hyper-focused a lot on economic value, which again, we will still continue to focus on. Are folks getting jobs that correlate with the time, energy, dollars put into their educational commitments? But also, is there a broader definition that we need to all be moving towards in terms of health and wellness, civic engagement, community engagement? These are things that you've started to see pop up in some places here and there as priorities. The Gates Foundation not only believes in that broader definition, but is trying to figure out what are the best ways to get that broader definition to catch fire. Is it about getting it to catch fire at the systems level, at the state level, at the federal level? I would say it's at a higher level than the individual institutions, right? Because institutions are motivated by things beyond themselves, and that's not a bad thing. That is just a reality of institutional practice. But those are some of the areas I encourage anybody to look up. Gates Foundation Post-Secondary Success Equitable Value Commission work. They really led the charge on that broadening of the definition, and that is still work that is in progress for us.
Thank you for that. The next question, and Laura, I'll start with you. Higher education transformation funding from foundations has been moving more toward support that provides development through organizations and intermediaries, such as CCA, who then work directly with campuses. How do U.S. funders engage with intermediaries, and why do you engage with them in that way?
Yeah, so ECMC Foundation is really focused on systems change. So we aim to shift the conditions that hold a problem in place versus trying to solve for the symptoms of the problem. And so I mentioned before our 3 strategic priorities, but 2 of which I think are directly aligned to systemic change. The second strategic priority of building capacity of institutions, organizations, and systems. And then the third one of transforming the post-secondary ecosystem. And so we work with intermediaries to be able to do that. We really leverage their expertise, their consultancy, their technical assistance, their network. We recently made a grant to CCA this last month around their data capacity building project. And so they are going to work with 8 systems or institutions to create metrics trees, develop KPIs, determine the data needed to monitor progress, develop data dashboards, and then the most important piece is create a performance management structure. Are they having continued conversations? What does that look like? What are the real-time data pieces that might change on a daily or a weekly basis that will then level up into the metrics or the KPIs that they're looking at? And so we really see the whole alliance benefiting from those 8 institutions or 8 systems going through that workshop, because the learnings will be shared across the alliance. And so while 8 institutions or 8 systems will be participating, the whole alliance will benefit. And I think, too, the other thing I wanted to mention, in measuring like our systemic change and our impact there, we have 3 phases of which all of our grants fall. So one is our testing and learning phase, where new knowledge is created, programs are piloted. We have our validating and implementing phase, which is where maybe programs are being tweaked a little bit or an increasing body of evidence is being created. And then we have our scaling phase as well, which is really where innovation becomes the new norm. So it's very interesting to see where each of our grants fall along sort of those phases to see where most of the work is happening, because intermediaries help with all 3 of those phases. Intermediaries will help develop new knowledge, will help implement, and will help scale.
Thank you. And Gabriela, if you could respond to the same question.
Sure. Trying to think of how to answer it. Only because I'm very passionate about intermediary organizations. The reason I came to work at the Gates Foundation was to work with intermediaries for scale. So a lot of people are like, why'd you go to Gates Foundation? And they think it's gonna be Bill Gates or like Philanthropy. Didn't really know much about any of those things. I was like, I wanna work with intermediary organizations. And part of the reason was because I had worked with an intermediary organization who worked with institutions of higher education. And what I realized in that time, especially if I was a younger professional, I'll share maybe a quick story, is I remember sitting across, and I worked from a national nonprofit at that time that worked with students from high school to college and to transition. And I realized I was sitting across from a president, and the president kind of just looked at me and they're like, you know, we have this list of students that came from your organization's nonprofit. We don't know why they're not persisting. We don't know why this particular student isn't showing up at class, or X, Y, and Z. And I think I sat there at the time and I was way younger and probably way more naive and judgmental. I was like, how do you not know? That student's on your campus. What I realized at the time is we both had a deep intent to support students, and we both had different sets of data. That president knew that that student was not attending class. That president knew that their DFW rates were X, Y, and Z. I was working with a program that had answers to the question of why that student wasn't going to class, that understand the familial, the community, the holistic context of that student's life. We could trade information within FERPA regulations, and we can do better. And I realized that individual institutions cannot go it alone. Students are not going it alone, right? So what we believe about intermediaries in particular and the strategies that we fund is that intermediaries provide crucial, critical, and sometimes unique opportunity for institutions to step back, look at the whole of their institution, and really make critical data-driven decisions about how to improve, how to transform. We often hear from institutions that if I didn't have time to sit with this intermediary organization and work through this process, work through these steps, review this data, quite frankly, I wouldn't have been able to prioritize the time in doing it. So the intent is there, but there's very rarely, I mean, sometimes you see in certain institutions here and there, like an institution transformation officer. That is not a common role. It is usually no one person's job on a campus to support institutional transformation. Intermediaries, depending on a different organization, they can prioritize it. They can say, this is what we're going to do. And so I found the experience specifically at the Gates Foundation with the intermediaries that we support. They bring crucial capacity, expertise, and ability to bring together institutions in that peer learning orientation, which is also, again, very unique to intermediary organizations. The last thing I will say in terms of the intermediaries that have been prioritized in the investments at the Gates Foundation is that we have prioritized working with intermediaries who have pre-existing deep and trusting relationships with the institutions that they serve. This is not an in and out, I'm gonna go do this thing for an institution. I'm going to work with an institution to understand their needs and walk alongside them for as long as it's gonna take, which is gonna be a long time. And that is the commitment that intermediaries that we fund within this portfolio are making. So I don't know if that's common. You all might know better than me in the field if that is the common practice for intermediaries, but I will say for the ones that we really look to fund and prioritize in this work, that is what we seek.
Okay. We have two more questions, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. What are your thoughts about the increasing request to sync industry and higher education towards state and national workforce outcomes? And Jasmine, I'll ask you to begin with that question.
Yeah, so my thoughts are it's a good idea. We should support that. In short, those are the cliff notes of what I think. I think increasingly there's been a realization that there's a really big role for higher education when it comes to upskilling students, filling skills gaps, preparing students for career. And so that's part of what has catalyzed this shift. It is definitely easier said than done. There's a lot of work to do. Thinking about things like employer integrated pedagogy for faculty. Our faculty, do they not only have student outcomes for their courses and their curricula, but are they mapping those to employer outcomes and what the employers are looking for and what they're hiring for? Have they ever spoken to an employer? I used to be a faculty member. A lot of times these faculty members, and I'm saying this as a recovering faculty member, they haven't been on the job market in 25 years.
That's true.
And so they don't know what employers are looking for because it's been a minute, right, since they've been in that position to have to, look for a job. And so, there's blind spots. And so providing spaces and opportunities to bridge that gap, thinking about high impact career aligned experiences and building them into pathways. Mm-hmm. If you make it optional, it won't get done. And it won't get done especially, students that look like me will not get to access when you look at the data on high impact practices, there's, it's disproportionate when you look at the extent to which white students versus students of color get access to these experiences, and that plays out in our employer outcomes, right? And so And sometimes they're not designed in a way that allows for quality and equity to really come through. And so how do we make sure that we are embedding these experiences in our academic pathway, that we're integrating academic pathways and career pathways, that academic advising and career advising are not just talking to each other, but maybe they're the same office, and we want to get students thinking, beginning with the end in mind, right, to take a page out of the Guided Pathways book. And so we don't want them waiting until first, second semester, senior year to say, well, what do I want to be when I grow up? They should be thinking about that before they even apply to an institution. That conversation should be up front. And so we should also think about working with admissions and enrollment people, and how do we ensure that's embedded there, and that conversation happens there, and that we've got practices like salary transparency. And so students not only understand the variety of majors that are available to them, they know the potential salary that they might earn as a result of graduating with a degree in accounting. And so it's very clear for them. And I think us as funders, it's our job to really think about how do we provide those space? Who do we partner with to catalyze those things? We were just talking about intermediaries, and I kind of want to jump in, so I'm going to use my last comment to. So I'm just curious, a little audience engagement, because some of you look like you're going to fall asleep. Who in the room is an intermediary or part of an intermediary? Raise your hands. Well, obviously the CCA staff, but okay, a good amount of you. Okay. Now cover your ears, because the elephant in the room is that there are great intermediaries out there, and there's still gaps in the field around the extent to which intermediaries are aligned with the direction that we are going. And so to find an intermediary, and CCA is one of my favorites, to find an intermediary that has all of these aspects and components in terms of, for us, we're looking at a strong focus on equity, the ability to not only understand that work, but to advise institutions on how to implement equity-focused work that lead to equitable outcomes. Change management, the ability to scale, the ability to document and cultivate learnings within, whatever your group of institution is, whether it's the Alliance or some other mechanism. The ability to manage communities of practice and create touch points across peer institutions, and the list goes on. And so part of our job moving forward is going to need to be building the capacity of the field and the intermediaries to help us do that work, right? Because I cannot manage grants to 300 institutions, right? There are not enough hours in the day. And so we can't do this work without partners like CCA and those of you intermediaries that raised your hands. And so something that we'll be looking at is, how do we help fill that gap and build that capacity when it comes to the intermediary level as well?
Thank you for that. Okay, last question before we get to you. And I would like for Gabriela, if you would take this question, please. How do you manage the politicizing and attacks on DEI with your foundational values and focus on equity as part of your theory of change?
I reached out to my comms team on this one, but so I'm gonna start with that, and then I'm gonna end with practice, right? So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a bipartisan, private family foundation. We have always been. So we have a commitment to work with any and all administrations in office, and we will continue that pursuit. In particular, we have a common approach, right? We identify a range of possibilities given any political context, whether it be federal, state, other. We prepare for the most likely scenarios, and most specifically for the Gates Foundation in particular, we respond to actions, not speculation. I think sometimes that could be a little frustrating for grantees who are like, we see directionally what is happening. Sometimes we will wait until we see an action take place before we step in use our dollars, use our voice. So I will say that. What that means in practice, as someone who oversees a portfolio of investments with partners in the field, it is more important for us now, more important than ever, to have our ear to the ground, so that as soon as any single action takes place, we can say, oh, this is happening, let's act. And so we take those prepared scenarios and that preparation for what was most likely, and we act as fast as humanly possible, which, depending on the foundation, is maybe not that fast, to be super frank, but the intent is there, right? And so I think that is, I guess, an ask for those not on the foundation side, is like, we seek that reality. We seek to know those truths. I think sometimes because of power dynamics, because of maybe newer relationships, those realities come to us delayed for very real and numerous reasons. For a foundation such as the Gates Foundation, which acts on those kind of realities, it can sometimes be hard, especially myself and the team I work with are very highly educated individuals who understand directionally the statistical likelihood of a lot of things, are also kept in a bit of a waiting pattern at times. So I say that transparently and for disclosure of our processes as to how we think about some of the political transitions and what that will mean for our funding moving forward.
Thank you, Gabriela. So now we're going to open it up for your questions. Does anyone have a question of our panelists? This is your opportunity. Yes, sir.
Michael Danberg with Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. I know the Lumina Foundation.
Could you stand, I'm sorry, so that we can hear you better? Thank you.
Sure. I know the Lumina Foundation and the Gates Foundation have made grants for advocacy groups, advocacy organizations. I don't know if ECMC does it. My question is, what do you see as the role of advocacy organizations in this new value era? And what is Philanthropy's role in supporting them as we enter this new value era?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I think similar to how we view and partner with intermediaries, we do the same with advocacy organizations. And in a very similar way, you all are our ear to the ground in terms of helping us understand what is happening in the work, what's shifting in the work, where might we need to pivot. I think the role of advocacy organizations, is in a lot of ways, I think the role itself is going to stay the same, right? We need advocacy organizations to continue to be the megaphone, to be boots on the ground, and also help us think about, how to paint a better picture when it comes to credentials of value and the value of a post-secondary degree, how to collect better data. Part of the challenge we've been talking a lot about at Lumina Foundation is we hope to have a multifaceted approach when it comes to manifestations of value, and some of the data systems are lacking, right? And there's some state systems that are exemplars and things like that, and so I think continuing to just be our boots on the ground, be our megaphone, and doing the work that you all have always been doing.
The only thing I would add, and that's the Gates Foundation teams at times are pretty distinct units. So post-secondary success is a programmatic team in a lot of ways. We have a whole separate arm that is more of our policy arm. And so one of the ways that we engage in advocacy is A, very carefully, but two, a number of our grantees who we might fund programmatically actually have very strong advocacy arms of their work. And so being very intentional and knowledgeable about how our funding is getting to organizations that serve a myriad of purposes. Personally, I would say I am actually very fond of organizations who take their programmatic, practical experience and can leverage it, turn around right away to advocate for things they are seeing in real time based on real time needs. Often there's organizations who can do both that advocacy role and that programmatic institutional transformation role in the context that we fund. And so I don't want to discount advocacy at different levels. So even if an organization isn't seen as, well, that's the advocacy org, I think there's a lot of work happening from a lot of organizations, including the Gates Foundation, in different ways.
Okay. Yep. Other questions? Yes.
Trying to stop it all possible. So we had a great discussion with a group of us yesterday. We made a joke that DI is to the DIE. And so with that kind of being the narrative that's happening, you know, grant writers like myself or as a statewide nonprofit feeling a little bipolar. So at the state level, you can't use the DIE language. At national level writing, you're encouraged to use the language. So how do you see yourselves as leaders in national philanthropy being able to be nimble if someone's in a state that has to shy away from the language, but yet the work hasn't changed? And so you're not seeing it in the writing, but you are seeing it in the work.
So, and this reminds me, similar to the last question you answered, Gabriela, and I did not run this by my comms team, so buckle up. You know, and in part of your question, Vita, you asked how do you manage that tension of which you just described, Chandra. And my facetious answer is that we don't manage it. Our goal is to be unflappable in our values. Equity is a value of ours. It is embedded in all of the work that we do. It will continue to be embedded in our work. And, you know, we've drawn the line in the sand on that. Now, what we're increasingly realizing, which gets to what you just mentioned, Chandra, is that we may need to change our tactics while still holding true to that value. And that is in an effort to provide cover to people that are on the ground doing the work, particularly in these states that have anti-DEI legislation, you know, where you know, I'm funding the University of Texas system, and we have been through it with them. And, you know, I'm just like, tell me what you need. What's happening now? You know, checking in more than we normally would. And so, you know, really just thinking about the privilege that we have as private funders to provide cover to those of you on the ground doing the work. And it's had to look different depending on the state and the institution, because you know, it's all the same, but it's all different depending on where you are. And so, you know, we're really just trying to meet our grantees where we are while still holding true to our values. And I want to also mention our director of inclusion and equity is Kristen Moore in the audience here, and she's done a really great job of helping us think about how to continue to hold true to that commitment, to the line we've drawn in the sand, but also meeting the moment with tactics that support people like you that are doing the work.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're at time, but I would like to give our other panelists an opportunity to respond to that as well.
The only thing I would add is maybe an example, because I agree with everything that was shared, is one of the things I appreciate about when the Gates Foundation named the focus student population of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income students is it wasn't just an exercise in language. It was also an attempt to be very clear about the practices at the institutional level that best serve our focus student populations, which, quite frankly, often serve all students. Why that's relevant now, and Texas is also a fairly large presence in our portfolio. If there's someone at an institution in Texas that says, I can't say that we're serving Latino students, we know it's best practice to connect your student success work with your organizational mission and strategic plan. And in any public university in the state of Texas, in their mission is plan is to serve the students of the state of Texas. Right. And so I actually don't need to say that because it's very clear in the mission and strategic plan of those organizations. If we didn't name that as a best practice, is leveraging institutional strategic plans and missions, it might be a missed opportunity. And it might be easy to sweep away what might try to be swept away, not just in language, but in practice, which I think is the scarier of the sweeps. But that's just something, and that's not something the foundation did. Like I've learned that in going to Texas and hearing how administrators are keeping their eye on the ball for student success at the end of the day.
And Laura?
I don't have anything else to add. They've answered really.
All right, let's give our panelists a round of applause. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you
We
for your
did it.
portfolio.
Yes.
Thank you so very
Do you want
much,
to
everyone.
go seated
Absolutely.
or standing?
You can stand on up.
Stand. Okay, well, let me put my clothes back on. Wait a minute. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, here we go. All right.
Right here. 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, ladies.
Thank
Oops.
you.
I'm still have my.
Mic.